question, like we have always thought of sacrifice ratio for the monetary policy, but way we have to do the fiscal compression, maybe we have to start thinking of a sacrifice ratio for the fiscal policy. But I'll also come to that. Dr. Virmani, can you hear us? So let me then formally begin our proceedings. As you know, that the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, EGROW Foundation, is about 3 years old. We are a research-based policy think tank in the NCR region. We believe that research-based policy advice is important, and it should be, and any policy advice should be rooted in high-quality research. Keeping that in mind, since October 31, 2018, we have been operating. We have been releasing working papers, and we have also been doing lots of webinars on contemporary issues that are important for India. We have been very fortunate to maintain a 50-50 ratio, a deliberate attempt of foreigners coming and speaking on contemporary issues worldwide or India, and our domestic professors, policymakers, and experts. We have had 2 Nobel laureates come and speak to us. We have had, and very fortunate, that in this time, when the Prime Minister has been talking of 75 years and 100 years, we have had Dr. Virmani, who chairs our think tank, Monte Kaluvalia, Professor Panagaria, Vijay Kelkar, and today, very fortunate that Dr. N.K. Singh has agreed to kindly come and share his thoughts with us. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, who is, of course, a well-known policymaker himself. He has published extensively. He has published in refereed journals too. He has been the chief economic advisor of our country. He has been the executive director at the IMF. He has worked earlier at the World Bank before joining the Planning Commission. With this, I hand over the proceedings to our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani.
Thank you, Charan. May I request Mr. Singh to put on his video so people can see him before I start the introduction? We can't see you, NKG. Can you put on?
Now?
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let me start the introduction. It's a very personal one. I have had a long association and we are very happy and I'm very pleased and honored to have him as our speaker. So I've had a long association with him over more than 30 years, and very briefly that's intermingled with his career. So I will use that as a kind of introduction. So I think the first major interaction I had with him was when he was Revenue Secretary, and I wrote actually the concept note on the income tax reform, and he was the one who weaved it and incorporated it into the dream budget as Revenue Secretary. Of course, I was in DEA, so my note went first up to FM and then probably reached him at some point. And of course, they were senior. I was not part of the budget group, so I don't know the details. But still, that was kind of the first major interaction we had. The next one, which was even more memorable and more direct, was when he was appointed chairman of the Committee on FDI. And he selected me as the member secretary of FDI, which was, which to me has been the start of, I mean, he's an excellent chairman, which is why I will give you a whole list of committees he's chaired, but I remember it so vividly, so I'll take a few minutes, which gives his character. I mean, what I remember is, his extreme professionalism, because I was selected because I was kind of an expert on FDI, but he throughout provided his vast knowledge and experience of socio-political issues, but left the purely technical stuff completely to me. I mean, that's really the mark of a great chairman, is to use the member of his committee, and of course other members also contributed because of his initiative on various aspects of it. But that is what illustrates what a great boss and chairman he has been. So since then, he has been, he chaired the expert committee on power sector reforms. He was chairman of the committee to review the FRBM review committee, and of course, most recently, chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, where again, he called on me in the sense of appointing me as a member of the advisory council, and we participated in many of the discussions. And also I got an opportunity to write a paper on defense R&D, among which consideration of non-lapsable pool and a DRDO commission came up. So his vast coverage, his abilities to draw the best out of people who work for him, and his very pleasant and managerial capabilities in managing chairing commission. He has since then written 2 books, one of which, for those of you who are interested, there was a very discussion at ORF where I was one of the discussants, if you want to know more about that first book. And of course, he has also been a Rajya Sabha member for, I guess, 5 or 6 year term, 2008 to 14 would be roughly a 5-year term. Yeah. And of course, on the current topic on fiscal complexity, he'll probably draw on another book which he has recently written. So with that, let me turn it over to you, NKG. It's my honor and pleasure to have you speak to us.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you for this honor and privilege, given the distinguished people who have, with such great domain expertise, whom you have invited and who have spoken. I really feel deeply honored that EGROW has called on me to share some of my thoughts on this complex issue of fiscal complexities. Now, I'm indeed really touched, Arvind, by your personal references and the number of committees and the number of configurations in which the two of us have worked together. The Revenue Department, the Planning Commission, and of course the Finance Commission. Indeed, so many things which you have not mentioned. I have often troubled you at odd times and odd hours to try and seek your advice, because your domain expertise and your skills, which are formidable, are equally combined with your endearing affection for me. And that's something which is embedded deeply in my mind. Let me go on to say that, Arvind, you have been modest in underrating the contribution which you have personally made in shaping economic policy. One of the things which you have chosen not to mention, Arvind, is not only did you assist me in these committees which you have mentioned, beginning from the far-reaching tax reforms of the simplification of income tax rates, and the committee on direct foreign investment, which I also chaired, and of course in other ways, on not only on fiscal issues but in the Finance Commission. But there is one symmetry in all this. The quality of advice has been such that the government accepted those recommendations. So the government accepted the recommendations, implemented them on the major dream budget, which you mentioned, on tax simplification. In terms of direct foreign investment, the recommendations of that committee, of which you were the member secretary, was a path-breaking change in India's mindset, in which we began to really deal with direct foreign investment instead of discouraging them, really beginning for the first time to remove caps, ceilings, debilitating regulations, and become part of the mainstream of India's economic strategy. Equally, your advice in terms of what you informally gave me on fiscal issues, on finance commissions, greatly influenced my thinking. So this has been not only the quality of your domain knowledge, but the quality of your advice, which not only led the committee to accept them, but led to the acceptance of those by the government. Let me also say that Dr. Sharan Singh, as the Chief Executive, for this opportunity, because you have been keenly following India's economic reforms. You have been keenly following particularly the fiscal issues, and you have been in regular touch with me on fiscal matters. I have greatly enjoyed talking to you. I've learned a great deal from you, and thank you very much, therefore, for this opportunity, which under your stewardship as the Chief Executive of this distinguished think tank, the privilege that I have to speak to you today. I speak to you, as Arvind said, uh, keeping in mind the subject on which you want me to talk today, but keeping in mind the fact that I have, apart from the FRBM committee itself, which is the major work of that committee. Although, in all fairness, there were others like Arvind who contributed. Dr. Urjit Patel contributed very substantially. Prachi Mishra contributed very substantially. And of course, Sajid Chinoy contributed very substantially to the shaping of the FRBM report, which I think is a fairly comprehensive document on the entire issues of fiscal complexities. But as nothing is really frozen in time, some of this I have dealt with extensively in my new book, uh, uh, which I have called Recalibrate Changing Paradigms, where I have devoted 2 chapters to fiscal and fiscal related issues. And those chapters really trace the history of India's evolving fiscal policy and the continuing challenges which they face. I have written those chapters, although it has select insights from another co-author of mine, Dr. P.K. Mishra, but we have the Principal Secretary to Prime Minister, but we have distinguished in the contributions which you have made, the chapter on the fiscal and fiscal policies. I owe the entire responsibility for really the framework of that chapter and the recommendations. So I think that since I go directly now into the subject and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, let me, preparing for that, briefly outline to you the thinking. A lot of the outline has been dealt with extensively in the book which I mentioned and which Arvindji was kind enough to also mention in his introductory remarks. And those of you who wish to look for a more detailed one, I encourage you to really go through that book. I don't want to make a sales pitch for that book, but certainly I'd encourage you to perhaps consider reading those 2 chapters, which I think are really a fairly comprehensive treatment on the evolution of fiscal policies over a long period of time. But let me say that in regard to the fiscal policies themselves, I think that it's always important to go back to the drawing board. The Constituent Assembly of India, which crafted the Indian Constitution in passing Articles 292, 293.3, later adopted as Article 268 and 269 during a discussion on the draft Constitution or the powers of the center and the states, talked extensively on prescribing statutory limits on the borrowing powers of the executive government. And I think that in the early years of policy making, there was, of course, a belief that a nascent economy like ours, where private capital was somewhat shy, private entrepreneurship was somewhat shy, perhaps an undue restraint on the borrowing capacity may stymie growth. But I think that the fathers of the Constituent Assembly were mindful of that and the latitude which they gave to the government. One of the most interesting things I must point out, Sharan Singh, is really that in a debate, which to some extent is reminiscent of a recent debate which I saw in this whole issue on the issue of the freebies and so on and so forth, and how much of borrowing you should have. One of the members of that Constituent Assembly, K.T. Shah, in a debate on fiscal policy, said, I cannot really ever imagine that the government of India or the government that might be would want to mortgage its land, its forest, its mineral resources, and its other assets which they have in order to contract borrowing. And sharply came the rejoinder from Ambedkar to say that I cannot think of a government which would not think, therefore, of a statutory limit on the borrowing capabilities. Well, that quest, which he had expressed in the debate of the Constituent Assembly, had to wait for a very, very long time. Because for the first time, this issue got visited in a meaningful way was during much later when the first FRBM committee report was considered by the Parliament's Standing Committee and thereafter adopted in 2001. Think of the time of that debate and the long lapse. In the meantime, which we all know, that notwithstanding other recommendations of the Sukhumai Committee report in 85, nobody knows better than Arvind, we did not have a legislation which was in any way binding in nature. Even the 2003 is only recommendations on fiscal policies, which give you a pointer on the direction of the fiscal policy at around 3% or so, with some other kinds of prescriptions on what the central government should do. But it was therefore, even that had to wait till the government of 1991 of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and NDA government to really get that enacted. In the meantime, no one knows better than Arvind and myself too that India's successive balance of payments crisis, which 91 was only a culmination. But you look at the number of occasions and time that India had recourse to exceptional borrowing from the International Monetary Fund and from other international organizations like the World Bank and sought really enhanced foreign exchange. India's balance of payments crisis were deeply preceded and embedded in a couple of years of unabated fiscal profligacy before that. So, notwithstanding the fact that this was a stark fact that you have fiscal profligacy for a couple of years, it manifests itself, it did not require, and we had such great econometricians of that time, iconic names on economics, to really, who would not have, of course, understood, but they couldn't do much about it, given the political milieu of those years, in which to see the spillover effects of unmitigated fiscal crisis into the external sector, leading to bouts of balance payments crisis, which we have battled through in our period. So, in spite of really the great recommendations of the FRBM Act of 2003, which enjoined on the government for a fiscal deficit of 3%, which they given targets, a revenue deficit reduction, prohibition of borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India. That, of course, was a major decision. There were features which this left out. And this resulted in continued fiscal profligacy, which we saw during the period, particularly in 2012 and 13, when, given the background of the global financial crisis, a pause button was pushed for 5 full years. There was no FRBM Act which was in vogue. And it really then needed a new government in 2014 when Mr. Jaitley, in the union budget of 2015, announced the constitution of a new FRBM committee, leading to the constitution of a group under my chairmanship with distinguished membership, and whose recommendations, I must confess, that the government acted with great alacrity, because the moment I gave the recommendations, it got pretty much implemented over the next few months, reflected in the budget of 2018, which really laid down, if you ask me, for the first time, debt as the principal macroeconomic anchor. This was one not altered feature from the earlier FRBM committee, regarding fiscal deficits only as a operational trigger for enabling the realization of the preferred debt targets, enabling a differentiation in the obligations of the center and the state governments on the disaggregated nature of their obligations on debt and things of that kind. So, as we go forward, I want to concentrate on the necessary fiscal architecture, which is necessary given India's current growth configuration. No doubt, the quest for a new Debt and Fiscal Responsibility Act, a prudent manner in which debt ceilings can be prescribed, and India's fiscal architecture for the 21st century has many, many daunting challenges. We know that the fiscal architecture for the 21st century must rest on three important pillars, which have been outlined not only in my essay, but outlined also in the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. The pillars being the pillars of fiscal rules, the pillars of financial management process, and importantly, fiscal institutions. Now, that's an area on which I want to talk about it, because the second generation of fiscal rules, which adopt not only one fiscal rule, but several fiscal rules with escape clauses and exceptional features of that, would be a classic ingredient of the second generation fiscal rules. And of course, the need for a medium term policy. So, as we go along, what are some of the challenges and issues in fiscal policy which I think still remain unaddressed? I will point out some of these challenges very, very briefly. First and foremost, in the context of the pandemic, we need to focus not merely on fiscal rectitude, but on fiscal forbearance, which I have called. Fiscal norms designed for normal times are not appropriate for distressed times like these. The last major global pandemic happened 102 years ago, long before the United Nations and other sister agencies came into being, long before the multilateral institutions had come into being. So the first really is, how is the approach of these multilateral institutions to be calibrated, keeping in view this challenge which this pandemic and the health emergency has created and its consequential aftermath of it? And is there a modality in which the activities of the sovereign, acting in conjunction with the central bankers, need to be evolved by a new set of rules? So I think there is a whole literature on the rules which favor fiscal forbearance, moving away from the rules of fiscal compliance, and what would the contours of this, and what would be an optimum mix between monetary and fiscal policy in exceptional times like these. Uh, Clearly, in saying all this, the absence of credible data, particularly in the Indian context of the informal sector, is a continuing challenge. While this is scarcely a time for deep fiscal consolidation, fiscal policies in the medium term must inevitably assist the recovery process, and a differentiation in the expenditure pattern, namely incentivizing capital expenditure than revenue expenditure, with multiplier gains in employment, output, and demand creation and capacity utilization. Clearly, investment in infrastructure through multiple initiatives like the National Infrastructure Pipeline and enhanced outlays for roads, highways, airport, and ports are no brainer. However, given the needs and lags, the needs of micro, small, and informal sector continue to be elusive. The distress of the informal sector cannot be overstressed. The service sector, in a more limited sense, the contact intensive activities have, of course, consequences for micro and the hospitality sector, and along with the needs of the government in terms of continuing a public distribution system or employment guarantee scheme. These are kinds of continuing challenges which we face in determining the cycle and the output gaps to be measured in terms of geographical and spatial distribution in designing a fiscal framework. The the contracyclical actions of fiscal policy are somewhat, with automatic stabilizers, need to be recalibrated in terms of some of these challenges which I have mentioned above. So I think these are some of the issues which, in my view, remains still unanswered, and we have tried to do this in some of the recommendations which were contained in the 15th Finance Commission. But as I mentioned, we do need a new national debt plan. And above more than the national debt plan, there are some other important challenges which I believe. First and foremost, the need for credible fiscal institutions. The case for an independent fiscal council, acting no doubt in an advisory capacity, has been in public domain for very long. Successive finance commissions have reiterated their recommendations. Now, over 80 countries, including emerging markets, have adopted fiscal council in one form or the other. The IMF, in a study in fiscal council, suggested that these councils would contribute to the use of unbiased macroeconomic and budgetary forecasts in budget preparation through preparing forecasts or proposing prudent levels on key parameters, can identify sensible fiscal action and options, and formulate recommendations, can facilitate the implementation of fiscal rules. Second, and connected with the Fiscal Council, the important issue of compliance and endorsements. Clearly, unlike many countries, the sovereign cannot be bound by any legislative requirement, particularly if Parliament endorses these actions. This would be equally true of state governments seeking the approval of their own state legislatures. Nonetheless, the issue has arisen whether this latitude and flexibility offers adequate protection against irresponsible populism. The continuing cycle of elections in this country offers enormous challenges and enormous opportunities for varied political parties to make promises which by no stretch are financially responsible. If elected to power, they are obligated to implement these commitments with far-reaching irreparable damages to the finances of the states. Mitigating the impact of irresponsible populist action would be integral to any compliance process. And this compliance process, we have suggested in the Finance Commission's report a couple of institutional reforms, particularly the need for really some kind of a fiscal council or an intergovernmental body, as we have said. Intergovernmental because it must have the states as an important partner, which can track some of this, enhance awareness, act like a kind of a debt advisor to the states, also be some kind of a play an advisory role, not a decisive role as far as the sovereign itself is concerned. So as we go through some of the electoral cycles, there are some important issues which remain very relevant. First is the relentless electoral cycle. While the central government is elected every 5 years, its focus on governance is constantly interrupted by unabated state elections. Each state election entices governments towards populist measures, some of which are known as freebies in popular parlance. This has become particularly endemic in recent times, where more and more freebies are being offered to influence the electoral cycle. There are serious financial consequences of fulfilling these promises in case of political parties who make their recommendations. There is no mechanism for the central government, except in times of emergency like the pandemics, natural disaster, to transfer large resources from the consolidated fund to the state. The transfer mechanism of the states is primarily governed by successive finance commissions. As I was mentioning, the system is inadequately built for any recourse mechanism or course correction once the recommendations of the Finance Commission have been accepted. Now, the two principal recommendations of the Finance Commission, one is what is what the Finance Commission gives under Article 280 of the Constitution. These naturally have to be unfettered because these represent the rights of the state. But in addition to this, under Article 275 of the Constitution, the large devolution of resources for revenue deficit grants for the third tier, the urban local bodies, the municipalities, for disaster, all of which add up to a very substantial part of the GDP, are not the rights of the state, they are grants, and they can be therefore subject to such conditions as may be considered appropriate for the central government to impose. The second is the issue of the financial mismanagement of the states. Now, this is an important area because should there be only recourse to what may be called, what Arvind would have called the sledgehammer approach under Article 293(3) of the Constitution, or would there be other mechanisms other than recourse to Article 293(3) of the Constitution to be able to encourage the states towards improved financial management? The third issue is the mechanism which would allow the voice of the market, so to say, to permeate and be to appreciated by subnational and parastatal entities. How can markets begin to recognize and differentiate in the cost of borrowing which states encounter between states which have managed their finances prudently versus states which have indulged in unabated fiscal profligacy? Right now, there is no mechanism by which the voice of the market can really begin to influence the behavioral pattern on financial management of subnational entities. Fourth, I would say that parliamentary awareness and understanding on fiscal issues remain somewhat rudimentary. Uh, Arvindji had mentioned about my first book, which is Portraits of Power. I mentioned in that book that in my 6 years as a member of the Rajya Sabha, I could not encourage my fellow parliamentarians to even devote 2 hours in my 6 years of relentless effort to discuss issues of fiscal policies because they were far too abstruse and they said, whatever you say is okay. But there was a lack of willingness to be able to consider, and yet they are really the final authority to really pronounce on the issues of fiscal policies. So finally, I have outlined some of these continuing challenges. What have we learned as the key lessons overall with this? First and foremost, India has not been well served in pursuing bouts of unabated fiscal profligacy. We learned from our experience that our balance of payments difficulties and recourse to unabated borrowings have invariably resulted in our balance of payments crisis, preceded by some years of fiscal profligacy. No doubt this has been compounded very often by other exogenous events of war, energy crisis, geopolitical tensions, or unexpected fuel and food inflation. We were better off in promoting fiscal behavior and to build reserves or cushions for a rainy day, so to say. Second, any false dichotomy between high rates of inflation not spilling over into the external sector is something which we need to put finally to rest. If you have years of fiscal profligacy or unabated inflationary pressures, it will inevitably spill over to the external sector, no matter how robust are your reserves. And therefore, this false argument that the nature of your borrowing, if they are primarily domestic or large reserves, give you a latitude forever, they certainly give you much greater room for flexibility, but they are not absolute choices, and that one is a flip side of the other. Third, we learned that a monetary policy embedded in predictable inflationary band is a major anchor. It enjoins on the central bank to pursue monetary policy consistent with this inflationary brand. We also know that managing inflation needs the active participation of all stakeholders, and demand compression alone has to be symmetric to supply side elasticity, and which really involves, therefore, the participation of multiple stakeholders beyond the mandate of the central bank. Fourth, we know that managing realistic exchange rates in periods of volatility on capital flows needs constant innovation and recalibration. Export elasticity goes far beyond competitive exchange rates and are contingent on the overall competitiveness of the export sector, which has several other variables. It is not mere fiscal deficit, but the priorities of public outlay, with continued emphasis on capex expenditure with multiplier effects. The past experience of neglecting the social sector, particularly health and education, has long run negative implications for growth and the human development parameters. We know that the central government alone cannot manage the fiscal complexities, but needs the active involvement and partnership of multiple layers of governance, particularly the states, acting in tandem with the central government, and I would now add the third tier itself. Last but not the least, both monetary and fiscal policy must encourage innovation, sustainable lifestyles, and orderly transition from an era of fossil fuel energy to an orderly way on non-fossil fuel energy to equally reduce the energy intensity of our economic activity. Mahatma Gandhi had said, economics hurts the moral well-being of an individual or a nation, which is immoral, therefore sinful. Rising expenditure, financed through unsustainable borrowings, rising public indebtedness hurts the moral well-being of a nation. That is why fiscal policies must be embedded in acting in tandem, where we must believe that responsible growth is not a luxury, but an obligation and a necessity for sustaining long-term growth objectives. Thank you very much, Colonel Singh, for this opportunity. And thank you very much, Arvind, for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on fiscal complexities. I'd be happy to answer the question. This is a written text. I would be happy to send on to you for your record a copy of this text so that after suitable edition, you could really circulate it to your members in any manner which you consider appropriate, Charan Singh. I did not want to take more time because I did want to summarize really the broader issues which I believe can generate some questions, comments, and thoughts, and I'm open to really making any observations as we go along. Thank you very much, Arvind. Thank you very much. Dr.
Thank
Charan.
you. So let me kick off the Q&A with three issues. I mean, feel free to comment or not comment, pick it up or not. Then I'll go to Dr. Charan Singh and then open up. So the three things came to my mind when you were speaking, and I know these you addressed in your Finance Commission, etc., but it may be of interest to our listeners here. One is this issue of pro-cyclical fiscal policy. I think there were some discussions and so on about whether India's previous historical fiscal policies have been pro or anti-cyclical. So if you can say a little bit on that, that may be of some interest to our listeners. The second point is what you made here, kind of a comment. I guess when we talk about education and health, there is an issue of quality reform and quality versus extra funds. And let me give a specific context to that. When the Employment Guarantee Act, the Education Guarantee Act, I forget the exact name, was passed, the main argument was that it will improve the quality of education. What the result is that the ACER surveys show that the quality actually declined. Whatever the ACER's surveys show that there was actually a decline in thing before it stabilized at a lower level. So this issue of being a little careful on expenditure versus quality issues. And the third and final point, which again you may take up or it may not have come up, but the rating agencies put a lot of emphasis on fiscal deficit. And this link between fiscal deficit and ratings. At some point in the past, I think my last year as CA or some time there, I argued for a zero fiscal deficit based largely on the arguments of ratings, in a sense. If we want to be an A-rated country, we may have to go down to zero fiscal. So just throwing that out, you can comment on any of the issues which I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Arvind. Those are very important issues which you have raised. I will comment on them very, very briefly. First, on the issue which you raised of the cyclicality pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical in terms of the overall fiscal strategy. Frankly speaking, we did grapple with this in some form or the other, both in the FRBM committee deliberations, and there is an analysis in that, particularly some members of the committee, and since this is now all of it is on the website, and I know so some members, particularly very distinguished members like Dr. Urjit Patel, then Deputy Governor, who signed, of course, as the governor. He had become governor by the time the report was finalized. And others argued that in a country which has such a large informal economy, the determination of which point of the cycle, the cyclicality of the behavior would be very, very problematic. And therefore, he felt that calibrating the nature of the fiscal response would be increasingly problematic. But in order to move away from some automatic stabilizers, I think that one of the recommendations which per se I mentioned was that in the fiscal architecture, as we refine the second generation of fiscal rules, the issue of the escape clause in some form or the other does act as a kind of an automatic stabilizer without going into the cyclicality of issues. And that, of course, we can argue that if you do better than what you're expected, there are recommendations. But if you do, due to some reason, you are much worse off, and you believe that there is need for exceptions to the fiscal rule, then resorting to the escape clause with some parameters which have been defined. So that's the way in which we have addressed looking at the nature of our economy, given the very large size of the small, medium, and informal sector, and the somewhat imperfect ability to have high quality data to determine at what point in the cycle you are in. You mentioned a very important point on education and health. Indeed, to share anecdotally, Arvind, that when the Right to Education Act, which has now guaranteed compulsory access on primary education throughout the country. And by the way, in per se, let me mention also that education is only in the concurrent list. Education is primarily in the state list. It's a state subject. It was moved to the concurrent list, and therefore in the concurrent list being the legislation passed on compulsory Right to Education Act, as we call it, a standalone legislation guaranteeing compulsory free education up to certain standards. When that was being enacted, I had participated in that debate. And in that debate, I have mentioned in my autobiography, which you generously mentioned, I have mentioned about my speech there that I had raised exactly this issue with the HRD minister at that time, that you are guaranteeing access. What about the quality of teachers? What about the quality of the faculty? And therefore, is there any correlation between access and guarantee of quality? And that discussion remained inconclusive. He said one thing at a time, but the fact remains today that the number of vacant teachers which are available, if you ask the number of vacant primary teachers which are available, this is something that the ASER report also successively has brought out, and I think they do a remarkable job in putting some of this in public domain, that there is no doubt that more than the outlay, the quality of the outcome on on education has to be very, very carefully taken into account. This is not necessarily true on health, because in health, my big worry is that as compared to the other peer group countries, our total health expenditure continues to languish less than 1% of GDP, states and the center combined. The central government only spends 0.3% of GDP. It's primarily the state government which spends 0.6%. And we have made recommendations to the Finance Commission what percentage of the state budget must be allocated for improving health and primary health infrastructure. So I think that the health suffers from three kinds of regulatory disability. First, Arvind, if you recall, and those who are here will recall, that ever since we had a health policy, and again, I would encourage you, without wanting to make a pitch for my new book, that one of the chapter on health which I have written there is a fairly long chapter on the history of the health initiatives in this country. But anyway, be that as it may, without going into that, one of the infirmities was the, the Medical Council of India, which was a very, very serious, debilitating its working of that. And it took three governments, if not more, to finally have a new national commission. It's a very major, major move, which happened only a few years ago. Second, all of us know that I have often joked that I do not require an MBBS to take my blood pressure or perhaps to give me an injection. Paramedics and, and allied health services are exceedingly important. And only last year, the regulation relating to the allied health services were enacted. And therefore, both these, along with other ways in which the some of the regulatory changes would really make an enormous difference in health, quite apart from the fact that obviously we need to increase public outlays. We have committed the national health policy in 2017, but public outlays on health have to significantly go up in tandem with the regulatory changes. And I think that can open up an enormous thing. What, in a modest way, we did in the Finance Commission is exactly to address. We have addressed all these issues, which I have talked about in the Finance Commission. We had a very good task force on health led by Dr. Guleria, and which had many other eminent Devi Shetty, Srinath Reddy, and others, we heard all the global experts and made recommendations. As we go forward, we did want to strengthen the cutting edge of the primary health centers. And primary health centers, in departure from earlier finance commissions, we directly provided close to about 75,000 crores, which will go to the third tier exclusively for improving the infrastructure of the primary health center. And we are conscious that infectious diseases, laboratory tests, and so on in primary health centers would be very important. So I totally agree. Finally, on this last point which you raised on the rating agencies, Arvind, I had my own travails because I had my own travails with the rating agencies, because while finalizing the recommendations of the FRBM committee, I traveled, I listened to all the key rating agencies. I don't accept the somewhat facetious response which some of your very distinguished fellow economists use the word about rating agency, that they are people with very poor knowledge of overall macroeconomics and economic growth and understanding. I tried to tell some of the friends that whatever be it, their voice is heard when countries make decisions on investment destinations. And therefore, we must take the concerns of the rating agencies on board. And one of the ways in which I did take them on board, listening to the rating agencies, all of them, the major, is by making in the changes in the FRBM Act, by making debt as a principal macroeconomic anchor. And they, more than the fiscal deficit, they were very keen to see the direction on overall general debt, which required the partnership of both the center and the states. So I think that the fiscal def instrument they regarded only as an operational strategy mechanism, and the principal macroeconomic anchor they believed is a sound debt policy, which requires the actions of both the central. But there is one thing which I'd like to add. I have suggested, both in the Finance Commission's recommendation, that in addition to the central government, each state government should have their independent credit rating. And this would really be a very important instrument in improving the nature and quality of state finances, at least putting them in public domain. If each subnational entity had a rating, independent rating, whose recommendations could be an important point. I stop here. Charan Singh?
Sorry, Charan, you want to
Yeah.
ask something?
So I just have two observations and one quick question. Firstly, sir, you have answered almost everything, and I thought very comprehensive. But sir, I have always thought Niti Ayog is bringing in to some extent the thinking and not the discipline per se, but at least the thinking. Unfortunately, when the planning commission was there, the planning boards in different states were doing parallel thinking. Many times now, I feel there's a very big disconnect that has happened between the center and the states. And you are right when you were speaking about the center and states. I think there is a missing block there. And with your stature, and I would recommend if the states can also be asked to have something similar to Niti in the center so that they can start thinking together. Otherwise, correcting the fiscal situation in the country, there is one unified monetary authority, Reserve Bank. But when it comes to the fiscal, it almost looks like Europe and everybody is on their own terrain. And the clause that the central government has to discipline the states when it comes to market borrowings or a component of debt that hardly gets invoked. So one thought was that, sir, as a milestone, probably if there is a reluctance, and I thought I wasn't very sure when the FM spoke the other day. I thought the fiscal council concept is not much in favor of the government. In case there's a reluctance, as you said, intergovernmental body, or at least the states Niti Ayogs in liaison with the central Niti Ayog can start bringing together the fiscal thing. Second, sir, I have always thought, and while I was at IIM Bangalore, I came and approached the secretariat at Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, saying that the fiscal issues are becoming so technical. How do these members of Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, who are firefighting in their constituencies all the time, give a thoughtful discussion or participate thoughtfully in the discussion on fiscal issues? And I asked those members at the secretariat if I could run some classes for them on voluntary basis. They could come and listen to the topics. Sir, if we could do something like that. And the third issue, sir, of course, is little more technical. While you are right in speaking about the fiscal profligacy, and you are right saying the country is always in a state of election. Center is every 5 years, but states are every year. And because of the internet and everybody knows what's happening, the country is in a constant state of elections. And constant state of elections means fiscal profligacy is there, and fiscal discipline is too difficult to manage. So, sir, the question is, in Europe, Madame Lagarde had suddenly come out with the transmission protection instrument. It's a bond buying program, and they are also feeling the same thing, that fiscal profligacy is going to increase. So now I'm feeling that worldwide fiscal profligacy is going to increase. That's just an observation. My question is, sir, you in your Fiscal Responsibility Act review and also in your Finance Commission report have recommended, and rightly so, that there has to be fiscal discipline. In the fiscal discipline, it is embedded that there is going to be a sacrifice ratio which states will have to make. How are we going to address that situation? I'm not very sure. Sir, your thoughts on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those are very incisive observations, Charan Singh ji. Uh, I will make very brief comments on each one of them, if I might. The first one, which you very rightly pointed out, was this in the old days when Arvind was also in the Planning Commission, so was I, a member of the erstwhile Planning Commission. Each state government had their own state planning board. In fact, anecdotally, Charan Singh ji, before I became a member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha, I was heading the Bihar State Planning Board. And I agree that the state planning boards had brought together a repository of a lot of domain knowledge and a lot of analysis on issues of fiscal policies, financial management, and so on. And that with the abolition of the Planning Commission, those have naturally have no relevance, except perhaps the only state which has continued with this state planning board is perhaps Kerala. They still have a Kerala State Planning Board. But leaving aside that, Niti Aayog has taken, in my view, a very commendable initiative in wanting a replication of perhaps some kind of a Niti Aayog type of a think tank as far as states are concerned. And I think that it would be, in my view, it's a very worthwhile initiative to pursue, except with one difference. And the difference is that the Planning Commission also had financial resources in the sense of uh, whose which the states valued very much. They had a 5-year plan. They have a perspective plan division, uh, which may or may not be in sync with today's thinking, a 5-year plan and that sort of stuff. But really speaking, I think that having knowledgeable, responsible, high quality inputs on financial and fiscal matters, the states would enormously benefit if they put together the advice of the Niti Aayog in having a state Aayog or some such thing, whatever nomenclature they consider. So I support that. Third is on the fiscal council issue, which you have mentioned, and whether the Niti Aayog could take some initiative. I think that the appropriate authority on fiscal council, because the the fiscal council, I think, relates to fiscal matters. Issues of fiscal policy are directly in the domain of the Ministry of Finance, and therefore it is that any fiscal council or any entity seeking to advise on fiscal related issues has to have a symbiotic relationship within the Ministry of Finance, and having it as an outside entity may dilute its ability to be purposeful. Finally, your question on Parliament's education on fiscal issues. I wish you good luck in trying to get together some members of parliament. I must confess that for 6 years, every year I tried, and every year I failed. But that should not deter you from your enthusiasm in any way. There are some organizations which are directly in touch with Parliament. You might like to, I'd be happy to put you in touch with Madhavan of the PRS. The PRS is an interesting organization that gives very high quality parliamentary research assistance to many members of parliament. And they also run programs in parliament during the parliament session, uh, usually before the session starts at breakfast or sometimes late in the evening. And if you could join hands with Madhavan of the PRS Secretariat, they have these interactions with members of parliament. And that could be one way in which this institutional linkage, they have an institutional linkage with Parliament, and that institutional linkage would be worthwhile. I'd be happy to be able to help you in that endeavor, putting you in touch with the PRS legislative wing with whom I have an abiding relationship. Finally, I think that you have mentioned about this constant cycle of elections. That is a reality under the current framework of constitution and the election rules. And of course, as we said, it has its pluses and minuses. It has the plus is that it is a periodic renewal of the elections and the mandate. It gets away from one size fits all by allowing each state government to give their point of view. The negatives we have discussed are many, but that's something which is a broader debate. But it is a fact that the constant cycle of elections does detract focus away from issues of governance, particularly on issues of sound macroeconomic financial management and issues of important economic growth. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I don't know how much time we have, but I see several questions. I don't know, Sharon, if you had a chance. I see one lady, Ashima, Amol, Dr. Nagesha. I don't know, do we have time?
If sir permits, we could take a question from Madam Ashima at least.
Okay, Ashima, you had some questions very briefly, please.
So, my question was, you mentioned that grants allow to impose conditions.
You're breaking. Just do it again.
You mentioned that grants to impose conditionality. But we know that, there is a lot of
Ashima, you are audible, but you are breaking, so I'm not able to hear.
So I've written.
Let me read out what she said. She
Please.
said, can conditionalities on grants come from fiscal institutions and collective bodies so that there is less animosity between center and states? And the second one was fiscal discipline also comes from rating agency and capital outflows. Has this led to more awareness of the necessity of fiscal discipline?
So let me first address your first question, Ashima. As I said, that resources available to states, broadly speaking, are under two broad categories. One category, which is under Article 281 of the Constitution, by way of what proportion of the net divisible revenues will go to the states, that whatever the Finance Commission decides, that has to be totally free of any encumbrances. Because if you see the history of the devolution to states, there was a time when the central government was dependent on the resources of the states. And we tend to forget that. And when it all began in the 1949 to 1952, just before the first Finance Commission took shape, at that time, what was being divided was only some part of the income tax. Thereafter, that proportion got increased. Some part of the excise got increased. Some part of the jute got increased. And later on, it was only in 2000, by the 80th Constitutional Amendment, that all resources, corporate taxes, then excise, now of course the GST and so on, became part of the divisible pool. And that proportion of the divisible pool, net of the cost of garnering those resources as certified by the CAG, which the Finance Commission decides to give to the states, there can be no conditions on that, right? So that's devolution, that's resources under Article 280. Now, under Article 285, because this what goes to under Article 280 does not go out of the Consolidated Fund of India. The Consolidated Fund of India, Ashima, gets created thereafter. So any other resources available to states go under Article 275 by way of grants, which are, say, revenue deficit grants, which we assess, which is, by the way, quite sizable. In my 5-year award, I have given close to 3 lakh crores, which goes for the third tier, which I'm not obliged to give, but all finance commissions are given, because otherwise the third tier will go absolutely in a very difficult state, because the state finance commissions are non-functional. That's about 5 lakh crores. Whatever goes out of the for National Disaster Management Fund, which is also a grant, and whatever maybe goes, what may be called state-specific grants, these 4 are grants. They go out of the Consolidated Fund of India, based on the recommendations of the Finance Commission. Technically, you are absolutely right that grants are not entitlements or rights, and therefore conditions can be imposed on those grants that these are subject to certain performance criteria. Now, but let me give it to you what happens in practice. So, say for instance, about 3 lakh crores went as revenue deficit grants. 3 lakh crores, how do I do revenue deficit grants? I calibrate the likely best revenue which any state like X might garner in the period of my award. I compress the expenditure to the extent that I can, particularly the revenue expenditure. Then I see that if there is an inescapable gap between the two, it is the endeavor to try and bridge that gap. But now, here is a catch, and here is why you are deadly right. Catch is this, that if one or two states, I will not name them, did make promises and commitments that if we do get this, we will behave in this particular way. They are not contractual obligations. They are moral obligations. They are embedded in trust, which is there. But what happens if the trust is broken? That's one of the infirmities, that there is no recourse mechanism. And there is no continuing memory on that. And that is why I think that, Ashima, you are right in asking that question, if that be your concern on the grants, distinguishing grants from Article 218 divisible right from that which comes out of the Consolidated Fund of India, being two. Issues of rating agencies for states, etc. See, the question is simply this, and that's also an important question on which I want to also draw Arvindji's attention. That's something which I mentioned in my comments, that as long as you do not have any provision, Ashima, or what loosely can be called subnational bankruptcy, as long as there is an implicit comfort that no subnational can become bankrupt, because they borrow just as the central government borrows upon the security of the Consolidated Fund of India. The states borrow on the security of the Consolidated Fund of the state, and therefore an implicit guarantee. If that be so, no lending entity for state development loans distinguishes on the terms of that, on the yield curve, between states which are fiscally irresponsible with states which are financially better managed. Say, as a classic example, without meaning, say it is possible that Gujarat, whose finances are in much better condition, may end up in paying cost higher for its market loans than a state like, say, Bengal or Punjab, where the debt to GDP is substantially higher than what the norms would be. Because they, as far as the lenders are concerned, they are comforted that they are secured by an implicit sovereign guarantee, which is embedded in all this. So it's a more intricate question of whether time has come for us to consider national
So
bankruptcies
some institutional mechanism
without
to create
resorting
more
necessarily.
accountability is what is required. Some institutional mechanism to create more accountability.
No, I would support that.
Mhm.
I would support such a contention that you do need mechanisms, but mechanisms resulting in accountability must have consequences for failure to become accountable. And that is the heart of the matter. Because I'll tell you an anecdotal example. And Arvind, you might like to enjoy. One of the persons I had requested to depose before the FRBM committee was the then managing director of the World Bank, who had been the former finance minister of, I think, Peru or one of the Latin American countries. And he asked me the question, oh, what happens if a sovereign government disregards the FRBM Act? I said, nothing happens. All that the sovereign government is expected to do is to explain to the satisfaction of Parliament that the reasons why deviation from the fiscal rule has become inescapable and larger public interest. So I asked him, what happens in your country? He said, in my country, it's very simple. The head of the government gets impeached. So I said, it's a far cry where the head of the government in a country like ours will be impeached for having broken the fiscal rule, or the chief minister would be impeached or removed from office for having broken the state level FRBM Act. So I think issues of compliance and accountability require definitely, Ashima, more holistic discussion. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, Charan, I ask you, I don't know, I thought we were supposed to end. We've gone quite a bit, but I have.
Yeah, I think that we are overstretched.
Yeah.
So unless there is a compelling reason,
Yeah.
Charan, can we end this session
We
or
should.
whatever? I'm in your
There's a lot
hands.
of interest, but I think we should probably, we've
Fine.
got 20 minutes over. So thank you very much.
Last question, sir. Sir, can
And
we
Sir,
ask
and all our listeners,
last question, sir?
see that Mr. VK Sarubu has been sitting there. He's the one I can see. He had a question, but anyway.
All right.
I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Huh?
Okay. I'll take it. I'll take it.
Okay, yeah, because we could have seen you. Mr. Vijay Kumar, do you want a quick comment question? You had a comment or question? Quick one if you want. Otherwise, we'll end. We can't hear you. Mute.
Sir,
Unmute.
last question.
Yes.
I think
Ask
it's
the question.
muted.
Sir, last question,
Hello,
sir.
hello, can you listen me? Hello,
Yeah, no, yeah,
are you able to listen me?
yeah, okay.
Whether the present government is in right direction in managing the physical discipline in our country, and what are your opinions regarding this physical discipline? Because always various governments are not following the physical discipline. Can you suggest measures to the government of India? Because they are always not in right direction according to me. Physical discipline is a very serious problem in our country.
Well, okay. Well, yeah. Well, that's a part of the whole talk. So let's just, yeah, because there are a lot of other questions on center state, etc. But thank you. Yeah. So, okay. With that, I think we'll thank everybody and move on because Mr. N.K. Singh is getting way over his time. And let me hand it to you, Charan, to conclude.
Yeah, sir, I must thank you for your time. I'm sorry we have extended by 20 minutes. We wanted to finish at 5, knowing that you are so busy, but then the questions were so interesting and you were kind enough to answer them. So kind of you. Must thank you. And we look forward to the written statement which you have, which we'll circulate and put it on our website too. It's always been a pleasure. I must confess, sir, always learn from you. And today also, all of us have learned. Also, sir, share with you when the first fiscal responsibility budget management was drafted at the I was on the research side, drafting it in the debt management cell. So when you were reviewing it, I was very keen to come and meet you, but somehow I couldn't. But then Urjit Patel also played a role. And so I was feeling, okay, to some extent, the Reserve Bank is getting represented. It was a path-breaking research, and the outputs that you put out in public domain were also so large and very satisfying. So next I must also mention that your book is so important. I do not know if you would agree, but I was wondering if we can invite you once again to discuss exclusively about your book. And we leave it to your convenience, sometimes in November or December, if you can agree to come and please discuss the other things that you have brought in the book, especially the regulatory aspects and those which are also very important. So we will be approaching you once again and seeking a favor on that. With this, I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank Mr. N.K. Singh. I also want to thank each one of you. I'm sorry we are running out of time. And I also want to mention next week we have Professor Gulati from IIT Roorkee, who will be speaking to us on sustainability of public sector banks. Same time.
Thank you
Thank you very much
you.
once.
Thank you. All the best. Thank you. Oh, hello, M Times.